Hi everyone. We're going to be talking about reading today. Reading in the age of technology and how reading is involved with critical thinking. When I give this lecture, I have a hard time trying to decide which of the two pictures I would like to begin with. This particular image you see kind of offers a way of thinking about how a child, for example, can enter into a book. But here's another way of thinking about the same thing. This particularly fascinating, almost exotic kind of representation is another way of thinking about what it means to actually enter into what you are reading. In fact, a long, long time ago, before my time, there was a book about a child who actually was able to go through a picture frame and enter the story that was depicted within a book. This particular kind of thinking, if you will, this goes all the way back to 1944, this particular book. This kind of thinking is a way of reflecting or characterizing what it really means to get into something that one reads. You know, when we think about it, we are reading a lot these days. I'm sure we're reading all kinds of things online about what has been going on with COVID-19. We read what is present on our Facebook feeds and other sorts of material that people send us. Needless to say, as students, you also read textbooks, as do your faculty. People read information from various sorts of forums they might be connected to, blogs. Maybe people even still read magazines and journal articles today. But we read all these kinds of things because they are typically electronically presented to us. Indeed, we read for entertainment, we read for information, we read to learn how to do things. But I would also ask the question, how do we read these things, all the things that come before us? How do we read them? Over the course of this, not only this semester, but all of advanced honors, 177A and 177B, we've spent a lot of time thinking about critical thinking, engaging with it, using it in various ways in the context of this course. And what I would like to actually spend a little bit of time thinking and talking about is what exactly are some of the basic requirements for critical thinking? And if we look at them, we sort of look at the underpinnings of critical thinking, I would suggest that we will have some interesting insights into the role of reading and why reading is so fundamentally important. So I'm going to give you a list of about 6 criteria or requirements for critical thinking. And the first of them is this one: analyzing by being able to separate a concept or system into its parts. Indeed, to analyze really means to take a complex concept apart into simpler pieces. Synthesis, of course, is its opposite, and it means taking simpler pieces and putting them together into something complex, an idea or concept that's complex. So when we talk about analysis, it usually is fundamental to critical thinking because very often we engage critically with concepts that are challenging, and by analyzing, that is, taking them into their parts, we begin to be able to have a fuller, better understanding of them. Another requirement for critical thinking is thinking in accordance with criteria. What I mean by that is what it means, for example, to think along the lines of, let's say, what is required in one's work, what is perhaps required in a particular discipline. So remember when we were on campus, if you, for example, would sometimes engage in parking in one of the parking structures or one of the parking lots, if you were to see one of the campus police walking through the parking structure, we could probably all agree that the police officer was probably walking through it, paying attention to very specific criteria. Are the cars all parked in between the appropriately marked lines? If not, they get a ticket. Are the cars properly marked themselves with the appropriate parking permits? If not, they might also get a ticket. The idea is that taking upon oneself certain sorts of activities means that one thinks in accordance with certain criteria. And that's a really important part of critical thinking, because depending on what those criteria are, it has everything to do with whether or not one is reflectively engaging well for what is of importance in a circumstance. Another requirement for critical thinking is recognizing the differences as well as similarities among things, and being able to sort or order them. So, for example, a very simple and everyday kind of experience of doing something like this would be, for instance, to take one's laundry after one's washed it and sort the various items in the laundry, putting all the socks together, in fact, putting all the socks together in pairs, putting other items in different stacks, probably putting them in different places in your room or in your drawer or in your closets. All of these kinds of activities are ways of being able to recognize differences and similarities and be able to sort or order them. This turns out to be important in lots of other much more sophisticated activities as well, being able, for example, to identify certain sorts of coronaviruses as opposed to others, some of which, such as the novel coronavirus, being a little bit more significant to identify than others. Another kind of consideration that is a fundamental requirement for critical thinking is being able to engage in research, to be able to seek knowledge, to be able to pursue information, or know which sources are going to be relevant to a particular situation or topic. This turns out to be important, for example, depending on the kind of research one might be doing. One might, for example, be interested in doing research for a research paper, let's say in humanities, but one might also want to be able to know where to seek particular sorts of information to be able to find a part one needs for one's car. And that's a kind of research as well, knowing where to go for information that might be specially or specifically relevant to whatever one is doing or pursuing. Another basic requirement for critical thinking is being able to reason from general premises to a specific conclusion, which we characterize as deductive reasoning. In other words, starting with a general claim such as all humans are mortal, identifying someone more specifically as falling into the category of being a human, for example, like Socrates is a human, and also, for example, being able to recognize that because Socrates is a human, Socrates is also mortal. That's called deductive reasoning, going from general to specific. We also engage in inferential generalizations, starting with specific kinds of information that will lead us to general claims about the world. So it goes in the opposite direction. Inductive reasoning starts with specific data or specific pieces of information and leads us to the ability to formulate certain generalizations. I find one pink flamingo, I find a second flamingo, and that one's pink as well. I find another flamingo, and it is also pink. After finding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of flamingos, I can pretty much generalize that seems to be all flamingos are pink. Usually, the only thing that will disrupt such a generalization arrived at in this way is finding an outlier, let's say an
albino flamingo.
What about this last requirement for critical thinking? There are more, but these are pretty much the fundamental general ones. And this last one is being able to plan and envision possibilities and be able to improve upon the ordinary. Why do we call this critical thinking? This is kind of, if you will, visionary thinking or speculative thinking about what possibilities could be formulated or arrived at. This is critical thinking also because in many circumstances we want to be able to come up with various ways to solve a problem, arrive at some innovation, be creative. And so this too is a kind of critical thinking. Now, when we think about this, a question we might ask is, all of these ways of characterizing critical thinking, they have a foundation. And the foundation for this sort of reasoning, but for all the kinds of activities we engage in with our reflective considerations, our use of language and thinking, are indeed the recognition that without language, we couldn't articulate, we couldn't formulate, we couldn't do all of what I've just been describing. So the foundation for all of this is language and reading, being able to communicate via language, certainly by the spoken language, but also by reading, that extraordinary capability of being able to read. Also, by the way, one of the reasons that I actually put these words, language and reading, in cursive is because for various reasons, our educational system has decided that we need not learn cursive anymore. And so there are lots of young people nowadays who are no longer really able to read the written word this way, in cursive. Here's a man named Nicholas Carr. He was born in 1959, and he's the author of one of the articles that you read for today. Is Google really making us stupid? This particular article certainly has a provocative title, but it's an interesting thing for us to have a look at because it's really about reading. Nicholas Carr claims that when we are engaged in reading online, when we're doing something on the internet and engaged in reading there, we read differently compared to reading a physical copy of a book or a novel or an essay or any other sort of work that we might be reading as a physical copy. So what does he say the difference is in engaging in reading this way? How does he characterize how people read online? Indeed, scholars have actually looked at this. People have exhibited a way of reading when they are doing something online that is characterized as a form of skimming activity. Typically, when we read something online, we start at the left, read to the right. Very often, if there is a column on the right, we will read that column. We will be less likely to read a column on the left. And we usually, if the article or the body of material that we're interested in reading is a number of pages long, we very often skim that longer reading. We may begin to read more carefully at the beginning, but after one or two pages of an article or book online, we find that we begin to sort of skip along and only read bits and pieces of it. The activity has already been given a name. It's called power browsing. What's particularly interesting about this, among other things, is that it kind of violates the principles that we have come to be familiar with in what it means to actually learn how to read. Of course, human beings speak before they read, typically. And because when we actually learn to read, to engage in learning to read requires a bunch of activities that really are demanding. We have to memorize. we have to practice what we've memorized. And we have to learn to identify certain sorts of symbols and translate the way we use those symbols into language. And the better we get at doing all of this determines the quality of our reading. And because this is a complex procedure, the quality of our reading will determine the quality of our understanding. So the better we get at the complex activities that we engage in all together that comprise reading, the better we get at that, the more likely we will be able to understand what we read deeply and well. So what does this process actually engage? It means that we learn a particular symbol system. We might call it the alphabet, and we might say, oh my gosh, well, that's pretty simple. But remember, at one point in time, when we were little, we all had to memorize the alphabet. And after we memorized it, we learned that it had auditory as well as visual components. That, for example, the alphabet was comprised of a list of symbols that we were able to translate into sounds. So we could sound out how to formulate words. We had to practice them, we had to practice using them, putting them together to form words, seeing words that were already formulated and figuring out how to pronounce them, how to use them, how to put them together to make interesting and complex sentences. And the more we practiced, the better we got at it. It's also the case that once we were good at formulating words and putting them together in sentences, we recognized that those sentences would very often be put together in longer units, paragraphs, entire articles, entire books, entire encyclopedias. The whole idea was to be able to see the connection among these bits and pieces called the alphabet that got formulated into words, that got formulated into sentences, that got formulated into longer compositions, and all of that together provided us with meaning that we came to understood. And of course, the whole point of this was an interest in accuracy, ultimately arriving at truth. So going back to what Nicholas Carr began to talk about, what is the agenda of the internet? Is it the case that we are supposed to merely read? Is it merely a way to represent reading? No, there's a lot more going on that comprises the internet and the information it provides. In many ways, it combines lots of different sorts of media. For example, it connects film with voiceover, with text that is by itself, with images, with all sorts of things that come together as part of what is presented on the internet. The information it presents is plentiful and varied. The information is also readily accessible and really useful. We rely upon it tremendously to be able to find answers to questions that perplex us, to be able to discover new things, to be able to do all sorts of things that would be much more difficult to do in the past. Quoting Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google, the Harvard Business School wrote a review after talking to lots of people who worked at Google to be able to actually sort of characterize what this behemoth of the internet actually did. And to quote Eric Schmidt, Google seeks to develop the perfect search engine, something that understands exactly what you mean and gives you back exactly what you want. And we've all been able to get used to using the ways that Google actually helps us out in these ways. But I might ask us to consider, doesn't the way we seek and arrive at information by means of using Google also train us? Train us indeed, not only to get what we want, but to want what Google, gives us. In other words, we're being trained by the ways, in fact, that we use search engines such as Google on the internet. Do you remember earlier this semester when you read Neil Postman's Technopoly? Let's think of a couple of things, remind ourselves of a couple of things that Postman was really concerned about. If you recall, he was particularly interested in what was the whole point of being able to write down information. It's something that starts the beginning of the actual book. He talks about Plato's Phaedrus, and he points out in the context of the discourse between Socrates and Phaedrus, that writing is a recipe for recollection, not memory. In fact, once we write something down, we give ourselves permission not to remember it specifically, but to remember where it is so we can go back and have what we've written help us recollect what it was we wanted to save by means of writing it down. Also, he was concerned about, that is to say, Postman was concerned about problems that were predicted by the invention of the printing press. Problems in one place, for example, could become problems in another location because of who read about them. For example, it's the sort of thing that happens in certain circumstances when we read the news, right? We learn, for example, that there might be a riot in one location, and it might motivate us to actually be sympathetically agitated because of what was being rioted about in whatever that location might have been. Postman was always interested in the kinds of problems that come from the internet itself, by the very nature of the internet, such as undermining personal privacy. But all of the kinds of things that we've just been identifying above, what it means to be able to write, what it means to be able to record and capture information by printing it and saving it, also what the internet can do, all of things clearly also have many good possibilities as well. In the Carr article, Nicholas Carr quotes the playwright Richard Foreman, who describes the difference, if you will, between reading to be able to read deeply and to be able to simply allow ourselves to immerse ourselves in information. And here's what Richard Foreman has to say. I come from a tradition of Western culture in which the ideal, my ideal, was the complex, dense, and cathedral-like structure of the highly educated and articulate personality, the man or woman who carried inside themselves a personally constructed and unique version of the entire heritage of the Western world. But now I see within us all, myself included, the replacement of complex internal or inner destiny with a new kind of self, evolving under the pressure of information overload and the technology of the instantly available. As we are drained of our inner repertory of dense cultural inheritance, Foreman concludes, we risk turning into pancake people, spread wide and thin as we connect with that vast network of information accessed by the mere touch of a button. And this leads us to Carr's conclusion. He says, As we come to rely on computers to mediate our understanding of the world, it is our own intelligence that flattens into artificial intelligence. So, what does this look like in practice? If accessing bits and pieces of information is really easy, could it be, what if it is, that we begin to mistake mere summary for literature, for example, or for conceptual complexity? In fact, that mistake, that being satisfied with less, is the focus of today's title, the title of today's lecture, Reading About Instead of Reading. So what are the downsides of the new reading that is readily practiced by our engagement with the internet? What does it mean to actually read about instead of really read? Let me take the example of SparkNotes. I think everybody is fairly familiar with SparkNotes. It's not unusual for people to have a look at them if they want to have a really quick and dirty summary of some particular text. If you look at this particular quote, this is from an article written by Alice Robb from the New Republic magazine about 6 years ago. And in it, she says, SparkNotes publishes free chapter-by-chapter summaries and reasonably intelligent analyses of hundreds of books, including all the classics taught in high school English. Reliable statistics are hard to come by, but one survey conducted by the Vacaville Reporter in Solano County, California, found that 60% of anonymously polled AP English students had consulted SparkNotes alongside the reading, with 18% saying they relied on SparkNotes alone. That is to say, those individuals didn't do the reading at all. But even students who use SparkNotes only as a backup, points out Rob, run the risk of becoming critically lazy. Why do we ask students to read complex texts? She says the whole point of studying English literature is to learn how to grapple with texts that are not always straightforward. The idea of having easy-to-read study guides that are kind of quick and dirty summary of what is in that much more complex work of literature really tempts us to shy away from the challenging work of really engaging with a complex text and being able to take apart that complexity into its more readily understandable parts ourselves. But again, let's move ourselves to the upsides of the new online reading and viewing. One of the things that has actually developed over the years is that people have new strengths in visual understanding because of the internet. We not only look at text, we get to look at images and diagrams much more readily, or graphs, be able to visually understand much more robustly than was typically the case, especially for younger people, for children and younger people before. People's visual understanding used to grow with age. And additionally, another upside of online reading and viewing is that many people have developed greater acuity and hand-eye coordination, particularly because of engagement with video games. Regarding visual understanding, let's look at an example that developed a while ago, but which actually measures the ability to think visually. A man named John Raven, some time ago, developed something called Raven's progressive matrices. These were nonverbal intelligence tests, And it didn't matter what language one spoke. It didn't matter whether or not one engaged in computational capabilities. None of that was relevant to being able to engage in visual understanding by means of these tests that John Raven created. What they measured was the ability to make sense of complexity and to be able to think clearly, which is the ability to draw out what can be understood from what one sees. And in a moment, when I show you some examples of what these problems from the test look like, you'll understand a little bit better. The other thing that they measured was the ability to store and reproduce information. One looks at something, one figures it out, and the idea is that one remembers it. It's kind of like what one does very often with YouTube, especially the YouTube examples of how to learn something by means of what is shown one in a short video on YouTube. But here's what those progressive matrices that Raven constructed look like. The idea here in these two examples is to identify the missing element that completes the pattern. Please note, to be able to answer or select what would be the correct answer in a puzzle or a problem like this, one has to understand visually the context and what would be appropriate in that visual context to be able to conclude and complete it. Going back now to the explanation, in this sort of surgery, a surgeon makes a small incision in a patient and inserts a viewing tube with a small camera. The surgeon examines the internal organs and is able to do this on a video monitor, obviously much enlarged from the tiny camera that's inserted into the person's body. And the individual can then use this viewing tube and what is observed on the video to be able to guide the surgery. What was discovered was that video game skill predicted laparoscopic surgery skills far better than was the case for simple practice at laparoscopic surgery. According to Dr. Greenfield, the best video game players made 47% fewer errors and performed 39% faster in laparoscopic tasks than the worst video game players. And again, these are the interesting kinds of skills that are enhanced by engaging in online gaming or electronic gaming. Again, according to Dr. Greenfield, visual intelligence has been rising steadily for more than 50 years, and so the idea of age developing greater visual intelligence is no longer really the case anymore. And she's come up with some reasons why. Her claim is that the more time people spend with visual media, the less they spend with print media. That increased uses of technology actually motivate increased use of visual media, and that because of increased levels of education, specifically formal education by means of various media, people engage with visual media much more readily and much more easily than would have been the case in the past. She suggests that improved nutrition and smaller families improve health and perhaps brain functioning, and the smaller families part allow for more intense engagement with various sorts of media, and of course increased societal complexity, which is very much a part of today's world. Now, if we want to think about the advantages and disadvantages that we've been talking about, technology really does make a difference. Its role in life, in fact, yields a decline in critical thinking and analysis, but an improvement in visual skills. Again, according to Dr. Greenfield, really reading for pleasure enhances critical thinking, especially when using actual print media, not necessarily reading online. And what is also interesting is that reading for pleasure not only enhances critical thinking, but engages the imagination, encourages reflection, makes induction much more likely to go on in the reader's mind, and certainly demands analysis. It's great for complex problem solving. Get really good at reading, and one's abilities for complex problem solving will be improved. Technological multitasking, however, and this is that term, multitasking is a term often used by individuals who believe and seek to be able to engage in doing several things at the same time. But in fact, it is demonstrable that it prevents people from getting a deep understanding of information. There's less learning connected to reading when one is also engaging in multitasking. But it is true in our 21st century complex society that certain forms of employment actually require multitasking. We have to pay attention simultaneously to multiple events. For example, an airline pilot has to be paying attention to what the plane is actually doing, as well as to the gauges that are providing information. Someone who's driving a cab through a busy city or a Lyft driver through a busy city is clearly engaged in multiple different ways that one is needing to pay attention to things. A soldier in the military would be doing the same thing, a preschool teacher, and so on. There are lots of different circumstances in which multitasking is required. But it is usually not the case that one is reading a text at the same time. So why do we read nowadays? And especially, what does it mean for us to read for pleasure? I'm going to spend a little bit of time now looking at a report carried out by the United States National Endowment for the Arts. The report was called "To Read or Not to Read: A Question of National Consequence." It was published in 2014, and I would suggest it is still profoundly relevant today. There were some national issues of concern that were identified in this report. There are 4 United States trends that the report addresses. The first one is that there's a historical decline in voluntary reading rates among teenagers and young adults. Another trend is that there is a gradual worsening of reading skills among older teens. A third trend is the declining reading proficiency in adult readers. And a fourth trend is one I would suggest we need to note well, that frequency of reading for pleasure correlates strongly with better test scores in material that needs to be read and in the capability to write. In relation to this is a broad, multifaceted chart that characterizes aspects of illiteracy in the United States. The chart is too small to actually read all the details of, but let me select a few and we'll talk about them as we go forward in multiple slides. It turns out that as of 2015, about 42 million American adults cannot read at all. They are functionally illiterate. Indeed, the number of American adults who are classified as functionally illiterate increases by about 2.25 million, that's 2.25 million, every year. About 50 million American adults are unable to read above about a 5th grade level. And what does this look like across the United States? Not all parts of the United States are equivalent with respect to the ability to read, with respect to literacy. What this particular map shows is the percentage of the population of each state that has below a 5th grade level of literacy. The darker the red, the greater the level of individuals who read below the 5th grade level. California is one of those states. The bluer the state, the fewer number of people read at a level of 5th grade literacy or below. So if you look, it is roughly not quite the central part of the United States, but the part of the United States that is in the upper half, roughly to the center, slightly to the west, that has the highest rates of literacy. And it is California and lots of states in the South that have the most problematic, lowest states of literacy. If we look at the map, you're going to see that New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and so on, and Florida, North Carolina also. These are the states that have problems with literacy, as well as California, Illinois, and New York, actually, also problematic. With respect to literacy, about 20% of high school seniors can be classified as being functionally illiterate at the time of graduation from high school. About 70% of prisoners in state and federal systems can be classified as illiterate. About 85% of all juvenile offenders rate as functionally or marginally illiterate. And about 43% of those with lowest literacy skill live in poverty. What this study is suggesting is that literacy is a significant determinant in many, many problematic life paths, life circumstances in the United States. If we were to look at the skill deficiencies that are identified by employers, most of them are connected to the ability to read and to read certain sorts of materials. So I'm going to look just at the 4-year college grad basic skills that employers wish students had more of. 41% of employers wish that students, or would prefer that students had abilities in foreign languages and better abilities and writing in English. More than a quarter of them would prefer better abilities in writing in English. 17% look for better understanding of government and economics or history and geography, and about 13% would seek better scientific skills in individuals that they would seek to employ who have graduated from 4-year colleges. With regard to applied skills, 28% of employers seek better written communication capabilities, 24% look for greater leadership skills, 19% look for more professionalism in the work ethic, and 17% would wish that the abilities in creativity and innovation were greater, as well as life learning and self-direction. So how many of them directly or indirectly are related to reading? I would suggest that reading specifically in a digital environment makes for cultivating certain capabilities or not cultivating them as dramatically and robustly as could be the case in other environments. To be able to really read effectively, one needs to pay close attention. People need to pay attention to be able to understand what they are reading. But understanding what one reads is not all there is to it. Individuals also need to engage in assessing what they are reading as they are engaging in that reading. And I don't mean assessing the value in the sense of, oh, I like it, oh, I don't like it, but rather, what is this text I'm reading conveying to me? What's going on as the message or content that is being put forward for me not only to understand, but to be able to engage with? What's also really significant when we engage in reading is that very often attitudes come into play when we read. And the idea behind reading is that we engage in reading with a positive attitude. And what I mean by that is we want to find out what the text holds for us. It's not about, oh, I've read the first paragraph, maybe I'm not getting it, and gosh, maybe it seems a little boring. That's the like-dislike part. The idea is, gosh, I'm reading this work, whatever it might be. Seems like this first paragraph is pretty dense. Maybe I have to take the time to analyze this particular first paragraph and find out what the pieces are that I'm supposed to be paying attention to as I go forward. So how do we engage in attitude cultivation as we read? What does it mean to create an attitude? The reason I have a picture of a spider here is because very often individuals find themselves having a certain response to certain sorts of creatures, and sometimes for some people, spiders are one of them. Sometimes, in fact, what I might ask you here is, in fact, unfortunately, I can't see anybody raising hands or signaling me in any other way, but who's afraid of spiders? This is actually a pretty large sort of spider. It's called a golden silk orb spider. It is not a deadly spider. It's not anything that would bite and harm a human being. But what's significant about it is that very often people have an attitude towards spiders. So what creates attitudes? Very often direct experiences with the object, certain beliefs that are cultivated about the object, and social norms that come into play that have to do with the object. And a lot of conventions, if you will, are in place with respect to how social behaviors regarding spiders for any number of people. So what about other sorts of attitudes? What about cultivating positive attitudes? My hope is that most of you, indeed I hope all of you, have positive attitudes towards spiders. But how do we cultivate positive attitudes? The idea is to cultivate positive attitudes by motivating people to want to be present to what we have a positive attitude toward. So cultivating positive attitudes toward reading books happen in certain ways. Turns out that children who are read to by their parents are much more likely to have a positive attitude toward reading. Also, children whose parents demonstrate a strong preference for reading for pleasure are much more likely to be interested in reading as well. In other words, if a child's parent sits down and engages in reading a book and looks as though they're really enjoying it, comfortably tuned in to that actual activity of reading, those children are much more likely going to want to read as well. So children are more likely to exhibit positive attitudes about reading for pleasure and are more likely to be motivated to attain higher levels of reading comprehension if they're read to by their parents, and if those parents also demonstrate a preference for reading for pleasure. But this is not necessarily true when individuals are reading their phones, because in many instances, children see parents reading their phones and not paying attention to them. So, what are useful reading attitudes? Cultivate the perspective of valuing reading. Believe you can do it. And be upbeat and resilient and engaging with reading. Reading requires effort. It also requires engagement. And that's the great reward. It can be really exciting, fascinating, really pull us in. In 2015, the Scholastic Publishing Company, a company you may remember from elementary or high school, that publishes lots of kids' books. The company actually created a report on kids and family reading. And in that report, they concluded that while people speculate why it is that children or young people are reading books that they would read for pleasure less frequently, the most powerful predictors of reading engagement are indeed identifiable. Children who said they enjoyed reading were much more likely to engage in it. When children felt that it was important to read for pleasure, in other words, that it was a positive thing to read for pleasure, they would also be much more likely to engage in it. And again, if their parents were frequent readers and seemed to engage in reading for pleasure, children would be much more likely to do so as well. But here's the startling thing. Lots and lots of parents indicate that they place a really high value on reading aloud to their children. They say, oh yes, indeed, it's really important to read to my kids. But what turns out to be the case is that, in fact, fewer than 2/3 of parents who actually held this view that reading to their children was valuable actually did it. People believe reading is important, but they don't necessarily read to their children anymore. And so what's interesting is that this modeling of the behaviors that would motivate children to read is going by the wayside. One of the things that I think is also important is that there is no boundary for parents and children or adults and children reading together. Young people continue to value having their parents read to them or having adults read to them, even after they reached school age, even as they went forward and were in middle school in some cases, precisely because it was the engaging activity of being read to and taking that experience in, not just the text itself, that was valued. So what about contemporary culture? We live in contemporary culture. Electronic media are very much a part of our lives. Indeed, in this age of COVID-19, we couldn't be continuing our university classes without it. So clearly, it's extremely valuable. And our engagement with electronic media has expanded our understanding of what counts as literacy. And I really do want to talk about how reading can be more than just skimming in the context of using electronic media. So indeed, traditional print media counts as literacy, but so do digital environments of all sorts. Being able to engage in hypermedia applications, being able to pursue links in a text, being able to listen to something being presented as you are doing right now, as well as looking at the PowerPoint slides, paying attention to images, and of course videos when they're taking place as well. All the different ways we interact with social media, all of these turn out to be really important. There's actually a hierarchy of what people pay attention to in the context of electronic media exposure. Anything that moves, if there's visual stimuli, that is going to be the thing that people pay most attention to. So moving a film or some sort of video of people doing something or animals doing something, those would be the most often attended to. Still pictures come next. After that come audio files, and still text is the least attractive in terms of what people will pay attention to. But all hope is not lost. I'm going to encourage us to continue to pursue all of them. And indeed, being able to incorporate them together, as we're doing right now. You're looking at still text, you're listening to an audio component as well. Occasionally I throw in some visual images. This PowerPoint presentation will not have any videos or music, but sometimes those are included as well. And so going back to that NEA report that we were considering a little while ago, the way to think about bringing media together is characterized as transliteracy. This is an idea of combining all kinds of literacies, many of which are relevant to one another, such as reading, writing, technological interaction, social interaction, being aware and a good understander of culture, both past and present, and that there are no silos, that is to say, where people simply engage in only one way of pursuing literacy. The idea is multimodality. And let me show you this representation of what our future reading and learning will look like. This is not one person's perspective. This comes from an organization called Knowledge Works and how they understand how multimodality will eventually work in teaching and learning, as well as the engagement with reading as part of teaching and learning. And here's what some of the segments have to say. So, for example, in the future, school will take many forms. Sometimes it will be self-organized. That means individuals will be teaching themselves, some of which you will be doing and must be doing now yourself as students because of the limitations on access to education because of our shelter-in-place requirements because of COVID-19. That work will evolve rapidly, not only because careers change, but to be career ready will require lots of new capabilities and understandings. How will individuals be able to demonstrate their capabilities? By means of diverse forms of credentials and certificates and other sorts of ways that we will be able to mark what it means to demonstrate mastery. Here are some other kinds of considerations that turn out to be important. Individuals will engage in learning in lots of different ways. If you notice up in the left-hand top corner of this particular part of the representation, It says learning will no longer be defined by time and place unless a learner wants to learn at a particular time and in a particular place. And so some of that is part of what you're engaged in now with respect to the use of online information. And also, whatever the path, radical personalization will become the norm in learning. I would suggest that has always been true, but the radical personalization part has to do with the fact that there are more media involved now than would have been the case maybe 20 years ago, or maybe even just when you, students, began actually and specifically to learn as students, as children, right? So lots of other things to consider, that this future multimodality will importantly need to bring about a participatory culture. What does that mean? It means that we as individuals need to engage in our education. Indeed, it's not possible really to be only a passive learner. Barriers to creative expression will be low, and so expectations for creative expression will be much higher. The whole idea of creating and sharing content, not only on the part of teachers, but on the part of students as well. Engaging in mentoring, not just teaching in a classroom, and some of that will be done even in our context, because there is no real classroom experience anymore. So mentoring will have to take place differently. The aim is to have all of our experiences be recognized as important contributions. And as part of the learning community, it's really important to continue to practice cultivating a sense of connection. And part of that will have to do with recognizing and listening to perspectives that everyone might hold. And this will be important as we go forward, for example, in the context of how our seminars will be taking place. That the line between content producers and consumers will be blurred. That means that not only you as young adults, but children also will be working together and engaging differently in the ways that they will learn and produce creative activity. But specifically, the fundamental presumption about all of this multimodal learning in the future, and actually as we're engaging in it today, is that people will still spend a lot of time with each other face to face. And again, that's a sort of surprising and troubling reality that is not being realized particularly well right now with our limitations on learning. Nicholas Felton is an individual who has engaged in multimodal story creating. He tells stories and designs the possibility for storytelling arrangements by means of using data, and arranges it in a way that one who views his material will be able to indeed develop and come to understand a narrative, but that narrative will be different for each person who pursues it. His what are characterized as data collections are actually being collected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, because they are such an intricate and fascinating way to put information together and tell a story. Here's what one particular panel from one of his data collections looks like. It has to do with a kind of arrangement of places that were important for him during a year. In a sense, it's a kind of memoir of that year, or a kind of anthropological or map layout of a diary. And depending on where you click and start, all of those kinds of connections that you make will be different from how the person next to you might click and start, and where her perceptions might go, depending on how she follows this particular piece. Here's another much older example, but also fascinating example of multimedia. This particular graph was created in 1869, and what it depicts is the beginning of the attack of Russia by the French army headed by Napoleon. The orangey-brown line that gets narrower and narrower as it goes from left to right begins with about 200,000 military soldiers that are going to be traveling to Russia. The end point of that line is Moscow. And what the black line shows is that once the French army gets to Moscow, and it is diminished to roughly a quarter of what the number of soldiers were to begin with, the group that heads back to France, because the weather becomes so miserable and frozen in Moscow, returns with only about 22,000 men, 400,000 down to 22,000. Fewer than, or about 20%, a little bit more than 20% of the military force actually lives to return. The loss was extraordinary. All of this can be able to be seen in this depiction of a graph. If you were to read Tolstoy's War and Peace, which is about life before and after this particular invasion, what is depicted in this map is depicted over dozens of pages in War and Peace, just with respect to the French actually leaving their homeland and traveling to Russia. Another component of multimedia is an understanding of semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs. And I don't mean just billboards. I mean all the kinds of things that signify and how these signs or signifiers are used. A man named Charles Sanders Peirce, C.S. Peirce, spent a lot of time writing about semiotics. And he says that it's possible to categorize signs into three different types. An icon, which is a sign that resembles its referent. So if you were driving down the road and you saw a sign along the edge of the road that has a picture of falling rocks down the side of a hill, that would be an example of an icon. An index, as a kind of sign which is associated with its referent. So, for example, if you saw smoke arising from somewhere as you were walking down a street, that smoke is an index or an indexical sign of fire. And thirdly, a symbol which is related to its referent only by convention. So, for example, the letter A makes the sound simply by convention. Or the color of traffic lights as signs for commands in terms of how we drive is merely conventional. This field of study called semiotics can be really enlightening because all of the ways we read signifiers really drive meaning making. Indeed, semiotics is also an exploration of visual literacy. Artifacts, symbols, All of these things hold particular significance in building literacy of all kinds. And what we characterized earlier as transmedia storytelling offers new connections and new ways of telling stories by using signs. And the idea is that we aim to be constructive, not limiting, in terms of how we present what there is to tell in multiple literacies. Everything we've talked about today is about motivation. And motivation is all about attitude. And I tried to explore attitude a little bit. But the best thing about thinking about attitudes is that if we get to talk about attitudes, or if it's all about attitude, our aim should be to pick a good one. It will help us to get to our goals. Critical thinking in the age of technology is often misunderstood. Very often it's misunderstood by us as causing us to decide between what appeals to us and what is of value. Do I want something, and of what worth is that something? And we usually make our choices, indeed perhaps too often we make choices based on one or the other. We base, for example, what we might like to buy on its cost, or nowadays its ability to be accessed. We might make some decisions about things in terms of efficiency or ease of use. What we eat. It's interesting to think about some of the examples I'm giving, partly because there are limitations precisely because of our sheltering in place. But what we eat and how we live, many of these considerations are being dramatically affected by considerations other than appeal and value. So it kind of makes my point by the time we get to the end of this particular slide, namely, what options are there beyond appeal and value? There are many more, and let's consider some of them as we conclude. How we access reliable information turns out to be really important. What are some sources of reliable information? If we're going to cultivate a point of view, how do we get to our point of view? We very often relate to groups being either inside or outside of a particular group, and that will help us to form our point of view. There's also this interesting phenomenon that has become really significant, not that it wasn't present before, but it's become significant in our contemporary era because it has to do with believing what we want to believe in some instances rather than really striving for objectivity. Information sometimes presents us with what we might want to believe, but it encourages us to pursue, or it should encourage us to pursue research so that we can actually engage more objectively in what there is that counts as reliable. We also want to be able to cultivate grounds for trusting evidence and how we interpret our perceptions. How we organize our thoughts linguistically, conceptually, is really a really important part of critical thinking. Again, analysis turns out to be important, considering possible options for how we organize what we understand, and always knowing and recognizing and valuing the need for more information. So, how then should we think critically? I suggest it is a fundamental truth that the universal purpose of discourse is to be intelligible. We use language to be able to be intelligible to other people and to make clear what we are trying to convey ourselves. So, grammar matters. Additionally, rules of reasoning matter. And I would suggest semiotics probably matters pretty much too. We amazingly agree on the usage and meanings of words. We agree on a set of rules for combining words into sentences according to the purpose of the discourse. Are we asking a question? Are we making a statement? Are we giving a command? Be safe, get well, for example. We agree on procedures for deciding if a given sentence is presented rightly. For example, how do we tell if statements are true? And how do we construct well-reasoned arguments? Indeed, we reason to find connections and inferences. These are the fundamental components of how to think critically. So, in the end, what matters about what we've been talking about in relation to this amazing phenomenon that humans participate in, namely the capability of being able to read? The idea is to read deeply for pleasure and have a positive attitude in life, to be able to enhance, explore robustly what can be learned by means of reading. Or as some of you have heard me say at the beginning and end of the semester, the whole idea as we proceed through life is to show up, do the work, and look on the bright side, something we're all practicing mightily as we go forward with all of what is surrounding us regarding shelter in place and the complexities of the coronavirus. To quote somebody you read last semester, Neil Gaiman, when he was talking about the value of reading, he said, Albert Einstein was asked once how we could make our children intelligent. And his reply was both simple and wise. If you want your children to be intelligent, Einstein said, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. Einstein understood the value of reading and of imagining. I hope we can give our children a world in which they will read and be read to, and imagine and understand. This quote comes from Neil Gaiman's essay, Why Our Future Depends on Libraries, Reading, and Daydreaming. Sadly, we have no access to libraries, at least not the physical libraries right now. So another one of the great advantages is accessing virtual libraries through our electronic media. My concluding ideas for today's presentation are as follows. As far as we know, at this point, there is nothing to replace reading as a means to acquire understanding. There's nothing to replace language as a means of communicating in a sophisticated way. Getting good at language to be able to read it and understand it is the key to learning. It is why, if you remember, ASHERBANIPAL wanted a copy of every written work ever created, and created the most all-encompassing library of his time. I hope you remember about ASHERBANIPAL from the very first lecture of Humanities 177A. It's all of a piece. It all matters. It is because of our capabilities of language and the ability to read language that the sky is the limit. Creativity has no bounds, and why reading is much more exciting than merely reading about. Thank you so much.